Here. All right, everyone. Hello. I am Liz. If you've watched me on the Facebook Live videos, I am one of Derry Public Library's reference librarians. I am both a, scholastically educated in terms of film and self-guided educated in terms of film, and just an all-around movie nerd and many. If I had to just give myself one label. So welcome to Intro to Political Cinema. This is my once a month film education, in some cases film recommendation courses, to kind of talk about both films and topics that I think are both of interest and import. Next month, I'm going to be doing a program on horror, or as I like to call it, how many subgenres are there and what will be left of them? So if you are new to horror, if you are a horror fanatic, or you would just like to get some recommendations on, horror for people who don't like horror, because that stuff does exist, feel free to join me next month. And we're going to be talking about political cinema today. And rather, obviously there's a whole host of movies you can find out there. Admit that. Oh, new person joining. Sorry, is a new person joining. All right. Hello, new person. So as I was saying, I've tried to kind of give a wide variety in terms of what we have here for political cinema. I didn't just want to focus on films dealing with the United States. I also didn't want to just focus on films that dealt with geopolitics or electoral governmental politics. So I tried to have, I think, a really good offering here, and also talk about the many ways politics can be kind of portrayed in film. Ooh. So I am going to get our share screen. Oops. One moment. 1 second. This is the fun of the fun of tech. Sorry. So share screen. All right, so we're going to start the PowerPoint. One moment, and play. All right, so again, if you have any questions, I would ask that you try to hold them, but also if you'd like, you can, let me know if, there's something very pressing. So welcome to Intro to Political Cinema. I guess I should say Liz's specialty, Intro to Political Cinema. I've chosen a screenshot of one of my favorite films, which I'll talk about, which is the Battle of Algiers. And before we get started, I would like to remind everyone, all art is political. So one of my least favorite things that I hear is, oh, I liked this show or this movie or this book or this series until they made it political. And I mean, that might mean overtly political, but number one, everyone's definition of what political is different. But ultimately, all art is political because it is reacting to culture and it is reacting to society. So in some way, shape, or form, what you are watching has a political angle, even if it's something as seemingly bland as Leave It to Beaver. And the screenshot I've shown here is the Bong Joon-ho's action film Snowpiercer, which if you have not seen it, I would highly recommend. A lot of people saw it as an action film, but there has been a lot of great writing about it that analyze it in terms of class politics. So we are going to start with my three favorite political films. The first is Battle of Algiers. So Battle of Algiers is probably considered to be like the grandfather of all political films. It's not the first one. There's ones that predate that. But in terms of a film that has had some of the most staying power, the Battle of Algiers is this. So what is it? What is it about? It's based on the events of the Algerian War from 1954 to 1957. And it's shot in a way where it's not I would say, a typical narrative. And there's no real main character. The one main character we really follow is a man named Ali. We meet him at the beginning of the film. He's playing a card game, and he's chased down by French authorities and arrested for something as, again, small as gambling in the street. And the background of this, if you're not familiar, so France occupied Algeria for years, and after the end of World War II, there were people who said, like, kind of like, why are you still here? And in many cases, the French were fairly oppressive of the people who lived there. So you probably can watch this movie and see similarities to today and to other social movements and uprisings of the past. This idea of, men like Ali wondering, why am I considered, basically feeling like it's illegal for me to exist in the country I was born in. And there's a great scene at the end where there are still people protesting even after supposedly the resistance is squashed, or people just ask, what do you want? They're like, we just want a free Algeria, meaning we want to be able to live in our own country as free people. And there's also an interesting subtext, or just it's an interesting aspect of it is one of the men they bring in, the commanders, to help kind of squelch the rebellion. He's lauded as a hero because in France, he helped fight against the Nazi occupation. So you see this man who fought back an occupation in his home country coming into reinforced colonialism. What I think the film does very well, though, is it doesn't portray anyone as 100% in the right or 100% in the wrong. There's blood on both sides. There's, collateral damage on both sides. And it's without kind of doing the both sides are bad, it's more for the sake of showing the reality of this battle and the reality of this fight. Fun fact, this was actually banned in France until 1971. Yeah, finally losing Algeria was kind of a sore spot for them. Moving on, another film I love with the director we are going to talk about again is Missing by Costa-Gavras from 1982. Oops, sorry. Sorry, I don't know why my, okay, that's my show. All right. Sorry about that. So if you're not familiar with Costa-Gavras, he's famous for the film Z, which we're going to discuss, and other films like The Conversation. Missing is his first sort of studio film that he did. A lot of the other films he did before were overseas and more independent. This was his first studio film for the United States, and it deals with something that at the time the United States really had not admitted to yet. And the reason this film is special to me is because I did not know about the United States and how it supported the coup in Chile until my history teacher talked about that when she said, well, there was another September 11th, and she had us watch this movie. And it's about, it's not technically about Chile. It's based on an unnamed South American country, but it pretty much is Chile. And it's about the death of journalist Charles Horman. So in real life, very soon after the coup in Chile, he disappeared. His wife Joyce was like, he went out and he never came home. So much of the film is about her and her father-in-law, Ed Horman, trying to figure out what happened to them. So Ed, the father, blames Joyce and her radical politics, whereas Joyce suspects that the government, and she means both the Chilean and the United States government, had something to do with it. And, unfortunately, reality showed that that was right. And I think this is a film a lot of people should see because this can be said of many countries, but since I'm an American, I will just analyze American films. We're just starting to get to a point where in our popular culture, we can kind of look at our past and see if we can right these wrongs, or at least analyze what we did wrong. And this was one of the first films I saw that looked critically at our actions overseas. And finally, a great film, a film that was kind of lost to time for a while, but was saved both by the Library of Congress and, more importantly, recently by Criterion Collection, is Elia Kazan's fantastic Face in the Crowd. So if you look at the poster closely, you might see someone who looks familiar, and you might see the name Andy Griffith. This is Andy Griffith's first film role, and very different from the Andy Griffith Show, and it actually almost ended his career, or really put a kneecap in it. But it is a fantastic film. It is about the birth and, more accurately, creation of a demagogue. And Griffin plays Lonesome Rhodes, this man he's a drifter, and Patricia Neal, who works at a local radio station, finds him. And she finds that he has a real connection to the people. And he goes from being a star to a national star to a populist mouthpiece to someone who begins to influence politics. And it's ultimately a tale that's old as time. I do love recommending this film to people because I just think it's a great movie. And people will tell me that it reminds them of so many different figures, but I always tell people, like, you know, demagogues had existed by the time this film was made. Father Coughlin is a great example. There's also the character of Patricia Neal is interesting as well, because usually in a lot of movies of the creation of media monsters, the person who's responsible for them kind of disappears halfway through, whereas this one, we are with Patricia Neal the whole time, where she sees her creation become a monster, and she has to grapple with it and ultimately try to destroy it. There's a great quote from April Wolfe that I'll read from this. This is found in the Criterion edition of Face in the Crowd. This is her essay. And she says, quote, "To call Face in the Crowd prescient wouldn't quite be accurate. That would suggest that the American phenomenon, Schuler's script, and Kazan's film capture what hadn't been with us from the beginning. This is a country where two-bit entertainers have frequently joined the political class, buoyed by name recognition and charisma alone, and it's perhaps the only developed nation in the world where that happens so often." And that's, I think, why I do love recommending it to people. I'm like, oh, you know, I think it's a film that remains relevant. I know some people, again, they throw around prescient, they'll throw around relevant now more than ever. I'm like, no, if you look back, especially if you've read the book Kurt Andersen's Fantasyland, it's like, no, we just have a habit of this. So moving on to what I would call kind of the like great films for intro to political cinema. And speaking of Z, we're talking about Z by Costa Gavras. This came out in 1969. So summary is a left-wing politician. He's killed in a car accident, but people start to suspect he was assassinated. And it turns out that that was the case. So some background information on Costa Gavras. He is from Greece, and this is a Greek film. His father was a member of the Greek resistance, but since he was a part of the pro-Soviet branch of the Greek resistance, he was blacklisted once World War II ended and the Cold War began. So Costa Gavras grew up in France, but you know, still followed Greek politics. And I think due to his father's background and due to the nature of how he came to France, he was someone who was fairly interested in how other people could be removed from power, even removed from their country. Roger Ebert has a great quote about this, saying, quote, "It's about the assassination 6 years ago of a political leader of the political opposition in Greece. It's also about all of the rest of them. For Americans, it's about the My Lai massacre, the killing of Fred Hampton, the Bay of Pigs. It's no more about Greece than the Battle of Algiers was about Algeria. It is a film of our time. It is about how even moral victories are corrupted. It will make you weep and it will make you angry and it will tear your guts out." And again, I actually, sort of going with Battle of Algiers, I think what truly makes a great political film is not just good filmmaking, but the fact that there is a universal element to it, to that even though you might not relate to the absolute specific setting, you can relate to it in some way, shape, or form. And Armand White, who, if you know about Armand White now, he is known more as a contrarian film critic. So if everyone else is a fan of a film, he will say the film is terrible. But he actually wrote a really good piece on this for the Criterion edition, and an excerpt of this is, quote, "Z is not a tract setting out the ideological differences that made Lambrakis the target of conservatives seizing power in Greece. Rather, Kostagavras and the screenwriter use his murder to ring the alarm on a corrupt and murderous seizure of power." So again, there is a universal thing that people in all countries here can be horrified by. Also, this was the winner of Best Foreign Language Film in 1969. So moving on to a more recent film, we're going to talk about The Lives of Others. So this is set in 80s East Berlin, so kind of towards the tail end of the Cold War, but as the Cold War was both heating up and winding down, that was when surveillance was really starting to ramp into high gear again, because the people in power were incredibly insecure that they are going to be losing said power. So this is about Stasi surveillance man, Gerhard Weisler. So he is monitoring a playwright and his lover, and he actually becomes more invested in them. And he also then finds out that the reason he's really monitoring them has more to do with a romantic rivalry than national security. So it's also about the disillusionment of a man who thought he was doing the right thing, now realizing, wait a minute, if this is being done for something wrong, what about everything else I've done? It's not entirely true to history, because I don't know if, I don't believe anyone on any Stasi on record has regretted their actions, and I can't speak for Stasi people, obviously. But it was also, it came out in 2006, 2007, right around the time where national surveillance, both in the United States and just overall, thanks to the global war on terror, was becoming a bigger talking point. So it was one of those, I don't believe a filmmaker went out to make it in response to this, but it was well timed due to a global conversation. Next, a film that even if you have not seen it, you have very likely heard the term, The Manchurian Candidate, and stars Frank Sinatra, the amazing Angela Lansbury. I mean, Angela Lansbury can do anything, but this might be my favorite role of hers. So this is an interesting one, because it is a movie that both lampoons Cold War paranoia and also gives into it. So we have the main plot is about a Korean War veteran. He's a hero. Turns out he's been brainwashed by communist forces to help, bring upon communist rule into America. We also have a Joseph McCarthy prototype who is repeatedly seen as buffoonish, making stuff up as he goes along. There's a scene where he is seen looking at a ketchup bottle, and later he's in front of people going, I know the names of 57 known communists. I have them right here in my hands, which is something Joseph McCarthy would do. However, the plot of communists using anti-communist hysteria to actually enact communist takeover, that is a very Cold War paranoia plot. Also, this afterwards, anyone know what happened 1 year later in 1963 in terms of assassinations? Anyone want to answer? So we had the Kennedy assassination. Actually, if you ever kind of go doing a deep dive into Kennedy assassination theories, there are some people who think Lee Harvey Oswald was brainwashed and kind of made to be a Manchurian candidate. So again, it's kind of become a part of our cultural lexicon in some way, even if you haven't seen it, but it's an interesting movie. I don't know if I'd call it tries to have its cake and eat it too. I think it's more the idea of, no, don't look at that guy over here. The real plot is far more insidious and far less overt. So moving on, just trying to check it and see participants. Sorry about that. To Kanoa, A Shameful Memory. So this is a Mexican film. This might be probably one of the lesser known films, because the ones I've mentioned now, they've won Oscars, they're in the conversation. This one is about a fairly horrific piece of real history. And it was an event in September 14th, 1968, when basically a lynch mob killed a group of students. So this is done, it's an interesting way it's filmed. It's actually filmed documentary style. You have the bit of the unreliable narrator facet there, but it's terrifying. There's a scene where these students, they're kind of sitting around talking about stuff. One of the locals is talking about the priest and how powerful he is, because, you know, it's a small town. People are isolated and they tend to get all of their news from this priest, who is a very politically motivated person. And they're hearing people screaming like, oh, the outlaws are here, the outlaws are here. And they wonder like, oh, who are the outlaws? And it's a gut punch moment, because these students realize, oh, we're the outlaws. And, you know, it does not end well for them. So just as I was saying earlier about Costa Gravis kind of tackling the sins of other countries, Felipe Casal, which was a fairly bold move at the time, not even 10 years had passed since this happened, he tackled a horrific event in his very own country. Again, it's one where I don't think I would have seen it if not for the Criterion Collection, and that's why I think it's a good, I'm a big fan of the collection, because it introduces us to these films, and this idea of how scary mob mentality can be. That is something you can find pretty much since the beginning of time, and it is unfortunately a timeless story. Moving on to Mephisto, or as I like to call it, the very dark side of Shut Up and Sing, or in this case, Shut Up and Act. So this is about an actor in the 1930s in Germany during like the rise of the Nazis, and he wants to be a star, and he pretty much compromises every moral and personal conviction he has for the sake of fame. And, you know, we eventually see what the cost is. It's an interesting film. Ebert's review, he went back and watched it years later, and he goes, I remember when I first watched it, I saw it as an explicitly anti-Nazi film. And well, it still obviously is. He goes, in this film, the real villain isn't the Nazis, they're just opportunists. If anything, the people who are willing to get rid of anything that they hold dear for the sake of getting what they want are seen as far more harmful. It's a gut punch of a movie. I'm saying that a lot, but this is one where I don't think I would have heard about it if not for 80s All Over. So that's thank you podcast for introducing me to films. And also this was another best foreign language film winner. This is a long watch, but it's I think it's great. And also, if you liked Cabaret and the idea of a entertainment film, or a film about entertainment set in the backdrop of Nazis rising, this will be a good film to watch as well. So moving forward, this is actually one of my personal favorite directors, and this is Shohei Imamura's Pigs and Battleships. Shohei Imamura is an interesting director. So he is one of like the many post-war directors in Japan that really exploded after the war ended. And there were some that worked before, like people like Ozu and Kurosawa worked before. And like a lot of post-war Japanese directors, he was a fairly radical person, because he had seen what the war had done to his country, and he'd also seen what it had done to the rest of the world, and what, poverty and very dire straits drive people to do. So he actually worked under Yasujiro Ozu for a bit, but and Ozu had his own kind of way he portrayed Japanese culture. He mainly focused on the middle class and the upper class, as some people have critiqued, the people that Japan liked to see themselves as, whereas Imamura was far more interested in the lower class, the underclass, the marginalized people, the people who were usually pushed to the side, not just in entertainment, but in real life. And Pigs and Battleships is an interesting film. It's about a young couple in Yokosuka, and it's a port where the American GIs are. There's still the Americans occupying there. And the girl, Haruko, kind of wants to get out of there. The boy is too immersed in gang culture, but it's also about sort of the weird, mutually exploitative relationship that the American GIs and the locals have. And it kind of flies in the face of the narrative of, oh, Japan just welcomed the soldiers in and it was fine. I mean, it doesn't go as badly as some other occupations in the past have, but the idea that people in Japan were perfectly okay with the Americans is not quite true. And this film shows that that's not quite the case, especially in the case of, you know, the reason the mob is able to operate as well as it is because a lot of the GIs are trying to get black market items. Prostitution is also a big business for the GIs. So you have, you know, women being exploited, but you also have the women who see it as, well, they're here, I may as well make some money off of it. Again, Imamura is a filmmaker that I think more so than a lot of other Japanese filmmakers, I don't know, Korieda's one as well, but Imamura is one who is very willing to turn the mirror to Japan and kind of say, this is who we really are. And he doesn't like the pretty side of it. He was fine with Ozu personally, but he mainly found a lot of those movies to be too pretty. So he's an interesting person if you're getting into Japanese cinema. So we're going to go a little modern now, and I don't think there's a way we can talk about any political cinema without talking about Spike Lee, who I think in terms of mainstream American filmmakers is definitely the most political one working nowadays. And BlacKkKlansman is not only one of his best movies in years, it's definitely one of his most overtly political, because he kind of went the more just thriller route for a while. He remade Old Boy, he did Inside Man. He actually did some fantastic documentaries on Hurricane Katrina, but BlacKkKlansman is a statement. I mean, it's a great movie, but it is first and foremost a statement. And if you want a film that is very overt about its politics, BlacKkKlansman's a great example, but that is Spike Lee's intention. And it's also interesting because this came out in 2018 along with Green Book, and Green Book kind of posed this idea of, if we all just get along, our differences won't matter, you know, racism won't really be a thing, whereas BlacKkKlansman puts forth, no, friendship doesn't change it, and if anything, the idea of some of these issues are so entrenched in our culture and they're so systemic, we might never fix them. And there's so many great scenes in here. The scene that continuously stuck out to me is it's late in the film. You see Harry Belafonte giving a monologue about him witnessing a young special needs man being lynched by a crowd. And it's intercut with Klan members watching Birth of a Nation. And eventually, Harry Belafonte's character starts to talk about how Birth of a Nation had just come out and influenced how a lot of people had seen Black Americans. So this is really Spike Lee confronting, you know, some of the very racist origins of cinema. I mean, Birth of a Nation is a film that is incredibly important to cinema in terms of one of the first full-length feature films and a lot of the technical techniques that it used, but you cannot deny the horrific societal effect that it had. So it's him kind of coming to terms with the fact that he is now the medium that he loves working in was popularized by a film that saw him as less than human. There's another great small scene with Adam Driver, who is Jewish, but you know, he's white. He's not someone who passes as Jewish. And it's a good commentary about how white is seen as the default, because he says, you know, I never thought about being Jewish, and now I think about it all the time. And kind of that idea of the privilege someone has when they don't have to think about their identity. And the character of Connie, who is the wife of one of the Klan members, I actually think she's the most interesting character in this film. I'm currently on hold to read a book called Sisters of Hate, which is about white women and women in the white nationalist movement, and how in the past, in terms of segregationist movements, white women have been very active in that role. But when we talk about the portrayal in cinema, the enforcers of these things are usually portrayed as just men. So I think the fact that Spike Lee makes one of the most overt racists in the film a white woman and someone who is very complicit in these activities, I think that is an incredibly, I want to say brave choice, but I'm like, considering, I guess, I'm like, well, you're acknowledging reality, but that's still something that's not seen as, it's almost seen as a taboo to talk about. And finally, if you've not seen the film, it does end with footage of the Charlottesville rally in 2017. It was not originally supposed to end that way, but the event happened and as Spike Lee saw it, he initially wanted to have this idea in the film that like, ultimately, though they were able to stop this small group of Klansmen from carrying out a terrorist attack, they didn't really change anything in the long run. And Lee saw the Charlottesville rally and he goes, well, it got even worse. These people ended up winning. It went mainstream. It's an incredibly powerful way to end the film. And I do, personal anecdote, I saw that with a few friends and it was a silent dinner of processing what we had seen after that. And one of the other more recent films, I'm sure you are familiar with this one. This is Bong Joon-ho's Parasite, the first foreign language film to ever win Best Picture at the Oscars, and me being a huge Bong Joon-ho fan, I'm just happy to see him get recognized. And this deals with a segment of politics that, especially in the United States, we don't deal with a lot, which is class. We're starting to again, but unlike other countries, like British films deal with it a lot. I've noticed it in French films. Japanese films will deal with it. Class is not really discussed in American cinema. Our politics tend to focus on the media, tend to focus on our elected officials. So Parasite is about a lower class family that kind of cons their way into working for a wealthy family, and things result. I really don't want to spoil this film because it's so new. But I will just say Bong Joon-ho is a filmmaker that a lot of his films deal with class. His film Mother deals with class. Snowpiercer, as I mentioned before, deals with it. And he had a great quote regarding this. It was an interview with a Korean station. He said, all the responses from different audiences were pretty much the same, which made me realize that the topic was universal because he had made this film to be about South Korea specifically. And he said, in fact, essentially we all live in the same country called capitalism. So, well, I mean, technically not all of us, but he was noting that the idea of the haves and the have-nots and how hard it is for certain people to get and maintain wealth seems to be a universal problem wherever one goes. If you have not seen Parasite, it is one of the films I would absolutely recommend checking out. It's, I think, one of the most astute class comedies I have seen in a very long time. So we're moving on. I'm going to do a little segment about the media in film. I'm going to focus mainly on American examples. So this one is All the President's Men. I'm sure we have heard of this because one of the guys, Bob Woodward, has been in the news again. So this is about their work on the Watergate scandal and kind of the one that propelled them both to fame. It's also a film that's not just about the scandal, but it's reflecting the disillusionment that the American public had with government. This was the first time, mainly thanks to television and more widespread media, that a scandal had been so public and so well known. I mean, it is not as if the White House had been scandal-free before Nixon. That is absolutely not true. But it's the first time a lot of us knew about it. And this is a film that reflects not only the genuinely hard work that Woodward and Bernstein did, but it also reflected the disillusionment that both they and most of the country had. But I think an unfortunate thing that it did for American cinema was it kind of led to the sort of lionization that we have of the press and cinema, which I can give or take. Some of it's good, but then there's films like Steven Spielberg's The Post, which I think is almost too uncritical of a love letter because, you know, news people can make mistakes as well. So our next film is Spotlight, and you might be wondering, why is this a political film? I will say, as someone who is originally from Massachusetts, I do remember when that report broke, and that was like a bomb went off. Essentially, it was. But still, I think a lot of people wouldn't consider it political because the overall reaction was, well, that's horrible. Something needs to be done. But this film, I think, aside from being a really good example of the more boring side of journalism, i.e. you have to go get these documents, you've got to go to courts, you've got to do some research, you've got to check directories. But it is a very good example of small town politics. And you might be wondering, well, Boston's a big city, but Boston is a city that operates in many ways very much like a small town. It is a very, at least on the political end, a fairly close-knit big city. And a lot of this film, in terms of them talking about when to release this, should we release this, how do we report on this, will we get the support for this, is kind of dealing with the politics of Boston. There is this idea of like, you know, you can't go against the diocese here. Like that's suicide. It's I think not only a great movie, but it is a great film from the angle of both news and small with Boston town politics. So we're going to get into a little more media critical stuff here with the fantastic, I think still relevant network. Great. If you've never seen this movie, this is another one. Seek it out immediately. Paddy Chayefsky just wrote a firecracker of a script. So this is about Howard Beale, who is an anchor who has a breakdown on air, says he's going to kill himself, and on his final show, and of course everyone tunes in. And while he doesn't actually, they're going to convince him to please not take his life on air, he goes on this rant. And it's ratings gold, and they realize, oh, we need to exploit this for gain. And it really, I think, did predict how prevalent infotainment would become. Obviously, it hasn't gotten to the lengths that it goes to in this film, because you still have to have a little bit of a satire alive, but there's something terrifying about watching it in 2020. There's also an unfortunately sad subtext to this. So about a few years before, a local news anchor named Christine Chubbuck did take her own life on air. Thankfully, no one has ever seen the footage, but that was kind of Chayefsky says it was just a really weird coincidence, but it's one where just now that I know that, watching this makes it a little bit sort of a harsher in hindsight. And final film on media, a great German film called The Lost Honor of Katharina Blum. So remember what I said about people saying in America, we tend to like the news? Well, this one is one that, newspapers, this is one that really takes apart the newspapers and specifically the tabloid class. So in America, the tabloids are pretty much just the tabloids, but in places like Britain and Germany as well, they are far more prevalent here. And this is about a young woman. She has a one-night stand with a man who is an accused anarchist, and the press gets hold of her name, and her life is just slowly ruined by the press. And they even work with the police to release details about this woman. And it's both a biting satire and a heart-wrenching film to watch. And it actually ends, it was taking on a real paper called Bild Zeitung. So the final line of this film, I really don't want to spoil how this movie ends because I want people to see it. But the way it ends, there's a postscript where it says, the characters and action in the story are purely fictitious. Should the description of certain journalistic practices result in a resemblance to the practices of Bild Zeitung, such the resemblance is neither intentional nor fortuitous, but unavoidable. And that's, again, that is I would say a takedown of news that I don't think I've seen in the United States, but this is why I chose to have a more international focus for this program. So moving on, comedy in politics. Because at the end of the day, we have to laugh about something. So I am going to talk about probably the most famous political comedy of all time, and that is Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator. You might, if you saw Jojo Rabbit last year, which also had a fairly buffoonish take on Hitler, this is definitely one of Taika Waititi's many influences. And if you did like that movie, this might be one you like as well. So this is about a Jewish barber who recovers from the First World War, and he sees that a brutal dictator has risen to power, and the dictator looks just like him. And what most people remember of this film is Chaplin kind of giving a very, again, buffoonish performance as a Hitler archetype. The Hitler in this one actually is not called Hitler, it's Henkel. But what a lot of people do not remember is, number one, this film was fairly controversial because it was taking on Hitler before the US had entered World War II. And at the end of this movie, there is a very sincere moment where Charlie Chaplin, he almost pretty much breaks character. And he gives this impassioned speech calling against war, against fascism, and calling for peace. And society where, you know, that's more democratic. And he got some blowback for that because people said like, oh, he's being political. And people were like, oh, I don't think I can watch a movie with him without seeing his politics anymore, which I find interesting because if you'd watch some of his films like Modern Times, I think you might get a sense of where Charlie Chaplin falls. And regardless of that, he was very alarmed by the rise of militarism and nationalism. And that's why he wanted to make this movie. This was a passion project for him. And if you don't have time to watch the film, I would at the very least go on YouTube and see the end of this film, that final speech. It's one that I think is, you know, it still hits hard after all of these years. So as you might have, if you came in early, you might have heard one of the attendees talking about this film. This is The Death of Stalin. This is a more recent film, but I think a great entry into political comedies. And that's probably because it was written by Armando Iannucci, who is the creator of Veep, or if you're familiar with British comedy, The Thick of It. So this is just about the power struggle and power plays that happen after Stalin dies. And a lot of this stuff is played for laughs. But the reason this film works so well is because it never makes fun of the people in the USSR. The people who are suffering under these buffoonish monsters are not the joke. They are the joke. But it's also a film that, as funny as it is terrifying because you see how good these people were at quickly scrambling and gaining power. It is a film that goes from funny to dark and serious very quickly. And it's again, another one where I love recommending it to people. It's also one I will give points to for being overall historically accurate. The only thing they really change in here is the timeline. They speed everything up for the sake of dramatic effect, and so the movie doesn't last forever. But it's a great film. I also love the choice that Iannucci made where he just told people not to have accents. He goes, use your regular accents. You have Steve Buscemi as Khrushchev, Mr. Banging a Shoe, screaming, I will bury you, Khrushchev, speaking with a Brooklyn accent. It's, honestly, if I could have any political movie, it'd be this one, because I'm like, oh, that's my aesthetic. I love it. Moving on to a film that was a big deal in the 90s and is roughly forgotten now, and that's Wag the Dog. It's directed by Barry Levinson, fairly well-known director, and it's about a spin doctor, the presidential administration, and a director fabricating a war to distract from a president's sex scandal. Huh. Why does this sound familiar? So, if you are old enough, you will remember a few times in the late 90s where Wag the Dog got brought up in real life. One was when Bill Clinton attacked Iraq during the Lewinsky scandal. Everyone immediately said Wag the Dog. And the other time was when he he dealt with Kosovo. I actually think this film really holds up well. However, I think people forget how dark it gets in the second half, especially with Woody Harrelson's character and what happens to Dustin Hoffman's. It's also a film that I think, due to the events of the early aughts, it's one of those where it's like real life became too real and suddenly this just doesn't seem funny anymore. And that's an unfortunate, that can happen with a lot of comedies, just time dates it. But I would say if you can find it, absolutely watch it. And a favorite of mine, which is, I still think Reese Witherspoon's best performance, it's up there with Legally Blonde for me, and that is Election. So it's directed by Alexander Payne, it's written by Alexander Payne and Jim Taylor, and adapted from a book by Tom Perrotta, which was initially based on the 1992 presidential election. And it's basically a school president election in Omaha being used as a way to lampoon national politics. So you have a very ambitious go-getter student in Reese Witherspoon's Tracy Flick, whom Matthew Broderick's character simply just hates, and you find out why. And he then recruits this kind of airhead but very likable kid in Chris Klein to run against her. And then Chris Klein's sister runs a nihilistic campaign where she just screams, don't vote for me, don't even vote at all. It's one where I tend to find that for whatever reason, 90s films dated themselves very quickly, but this movie is still great 20 years later. Absolutely fantastic film. If you've read the Tom Perrotta book, there are some differences in it, but I think the differences made fit the film very well. So we are now moving on to probably what is going to be my favorite segment, genre as a means to discuss politics. So when people think of horror and sci-fi, now it's fairly common to think about like a socio-political angle for them. But back in like the 50s and before that, people did not think of politics when they thought of sci-fi and horror. They thought of ghosts and they thought of cheesy monsters. So we have Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which, if you are not familiar with the plot, people are being replaced with exact copies of themselves, but they don't show emotion. And it happens when you go to sleep. And there's, you know, the great ending of this film is Kevin McCarthy screaming at the camera, "They're coming, you're next." And at the time, a lot of people read this film, and some do still read this film, as an allegory for communism. Like, the Red Menace is coming, it's going to get you in your sleep. Like, again, a very deeply rooted Cold War fear. However, there are other readings of this film that actually see it as a warning against McCarthyism and the the crushing conformity that suburbia requested of people. Don Siegel, who directed this, he's like, "I just saw it as I was directing an alien movie, guys. Sorry." So this movie has also gone on to be remade a number of times. There is the stellar 1978 remake with Donald Sutherland, which lampoons the kind of "I'm okay, you're okay" culture of the 70s, where no one really talked about their problems. They actually do a very interesting thing in that film, where the first people to notice that their spouses, their loved ones, are not right are women, and they're pretty quickly dismissed as hysterical, and an immigrant, a man who runs a laundromat, and Donald Sutherland's character is like, "Oh, your wife's just sick, it's fine." And it's I don't know if that is an intended commentary, but that's something I saw as interesting. The year is a 1993 remake directed by Abel Ferreira, which takes place on a military base. And as a military brat, I kind of found that to be an interesting angle. It's not my favorite, but it's still interesting. And then there's the 2007 version, which does nothing. It literally has no position. It's terrible. Do not watch The Invasion. There are much better political films or political genre movies out there, such as Jordan Peele's 2017 Get Out. So Jordan Peele was known mostly for comedy from Key and Peele, and then he came on the scene in 2017 and created just a horror masterpiece. It was my favorite movie of 2017. So, and it was interesting is it played with the expectation as to what people would expect. I think a lot of people figured racism would factor into this film in some way, but the way it does is interesting. So the character of Chris, played by Daniel Kaluuya, goes to meet his white girlfriend's family, and he just realizes something's wrong very quickly, which I actually appreciated. He wasn't oblivious to it. He's like, "This is weird, I need to leave." But in there, there's allusions to Rosemary's Baby in this movie. There's a real allusion to the Stepford Wives. If I had to pick any film that is like a spiritual sibling, it's that one. But it's not what people are trying to do is essentially use Black bodies as a way to prolong their life. I'm not going to say how, but usually when we all saw this, we're like, "Oh, is he just going to be killed?" And that's not the case. And it's an interesting film that I guess it talks about like sort of the culture vulture racism, where a lot of people have talked about how it's like, when Black women wear braids, it's considered inappropriate. When white women do it, like Kim Kardashian, it's a fashion trend. When Black women are very curvaceous, it's not seen as pretty. But again, when Kim Kardashian it's great. So they will, people will adopt these characteristics. But I just think the scariest thing about this film is that it actually really does, I think, tie back to slavery, because ultimately what this group is trying to do is they use Black bodies. They see Black bodies as a thing to be coveted rather than a human being that's a person. And that's the most disturbing thing about this movie. Moving on, another more recent film, This is more, I would say, it's sci-fi / surrealism, and that's Boots Riley's Sorry to Bother You. It's definitely not as polished and like Jordan Peele's Get Out, there's no fat on that. This one has a lot of ideas in it to the point where not all of them are well developed, but it's a really interesting film. It looks at corporate culture, it looks at Silicon Valley, and the idea of these companies that will employ everyone in the neighborhood. It was Walmart in the 90s, in some places it's Amazon, and the companies that expect their employees to be workhorses. And also the idea that some people will look at, profit over humanity. Again, I do not think this is a perfect film, but it is a film that has such a vision and such a point of view. It is, and again, the way it goes about it, it has a weird, like, surrealist sci-fi edge. It's one where I think people should see it for the sake of seeing it. So moving on, eventually we were going to get to this. John Carpenter's They Live, starring the dearly departed Rowdy Roddy Piper. I would describe this as a hate letter to the Reagan 80s. And John Carpenter's pretty much says as such. He said it was supposed to be kind of the anti-Morning in America. So the main character is a man who's a drifter. He's basically going place to place trying to survive. He gets a job in construction, and he lives in a tent city, which are repeatedly being, bulldozed and brutalized by police because they're like, oh, well, we need this land for something. And he finds out that the world is being controlled by a race of aliens who are putting subliminal messages everywhere, and the only way you can see them is with glasses. This sounds ridiculous, but believe it or not, it works. And it's ultimately, I think, a really good critique of consumerist culture, because while he goes for like the stuff the everyday stuff of like the secret societies controlling things, a lot of what you see when you put on the glasses is billboards that say consume, obey. If you've seen the Obey, that's where it comes from. Unfortunately, this film has been hijacked by people who use it for fairly anti-Semitic means. And John Carpenter himself has pretty much said, get your film out of my mouth. But that is an unfortunate problem, is sometimes people who make these movies, they can't control who will use them for what means. So a film that is good to watch in conjunction with They Live is this little scene film called Society. And this might be the reason I actually had this program, was because I wanted to talk about Society. So, directed by Brian Yunza, where he worked on Reanimator, if you're a horror fan. And this is about a young man who starts to realize his family isn't as normal as he thinks they are. And it's one of the most interesting films about class ever made. And it's essentially about WASPs, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant types, although I don't even know if these fit as WASP, but it's old money. These are old money people. They're, even if you're new money, you're not exactly accepted. And it's these old money types who are also eldritch abominations. It's a film that I love to recommend to people, but I have to absolutely warn them. The final 20 minutes of the film is not for the faint of heart. If I have to give you a hint of what it is, look at that tagline that says, "The rich have always fed off the poor. This time it's for real." Now, I'll leave it at that. Interesting note about this movie, this did not make a big splash in the United States when it came out. However, in Britain, where again, class is something that is far more openly discussed in both real life and in media, it made a big splash there. And, it's gotten kind of a cult following. So moving on to our final few films, I just wanted to talk about women in cinema and how that relates to politics, because sometimes simply having a woman in a film makes it political. As I was talking about at the start, people are like, I hate it when Star Wars is political. They said that by the casting of Daisy Ridley, which the fact that her character was a woman and the main character in Star Wars somehow made it political for certain people. And I think Thelma and Louise is a good example, because Callie Khouri, the woman who wrote it, she initially did not intend this movie to be a feminist statement. She wanted it to be a road movie. She was like, well, we have all these movies about men who go on the road and they become outlaws, but we don't have that with women. But she also wanted to talk about like the experiences that women have. So Thelma and Louise, they go on a trip, and when they defend themselves from assault, it goes from bad to worse. And it's like one of the reasons they don't even go to the police is because Susan Sarandon's character is like, you know, they're not going to believe you because they saw you dancing with that guy all night. Like the police are going to just think we killed him for no reason. And you know, unfortunately, that idea of I'm not going to be believed is a reality for a lot of women. And it's kind of interesting because this film has become a modern classic. A lot of people reference it. It's a part of a cultural lexicon. But it was very controversial when it came out. Again, I wanted to specifically find the Time magazine cover. There were people who accused it of man-hating. There were also people that accused it of not being feminist enough or showing, you know, women encouraging bad behavior. And again, I'll just go back to Khouri, who just said, you know, she made this as a road movie. And she said, as a moviegoer, I just got fed up with the passive role of women. They were never driving the story because they were never driving the car. And that's what she really wanted to make. She goes, I was sick of seeing women as passive partners, terminally ill women, sex objects. I wanted to write something that had never been seen on screen before. And she also, this is actually from the Time magazine piece in here. I was able to find it on EBSCO. She countered people who said, like, you know, this might hate men. She goes, it says, quote, she is annoyed by critics who charge her that the film provides poor role models for women. Quote, they don't really want to see women operating outside of the boundaries that are prescribed for them, misbehaving and enjoying themselves, she says. Nor does she take kindly to the criticism that the movie bashes men. Quote, I certainly don't hate men, says Khouri, who celebrates her first year of marriage to writer-producer David Warfield this month. Quote, most guys don't relate to the truck driver or the rapist, and if they do, their problems are bigger than this movie. So if you've never seen Thelma and Louise, I would highly recommend checking it out. So moving forward, or moving back in this case, Agnes Varda, very prolific French filmmaker, and she wrote a lot of great films about women, and she wrote in 1977 a feminist musical called One Sings and the Other Doesn't. And this actually got a little bit of critique when it came out. It was more of an idealized view of women's liberation, but most of what it addresses is women's autonomy and reproductive rights. In France, it's very specific to the time, but it's also about the friendship between these two women. They keep in touch via postcards. They talk about their you know, lovers, their trips, their children. And ultimately, at the end of this movie, it is about just the idea, it just argues for, you know, women's right to just live lives as they wish. I think it's a very wonderful, compassionate film. And again, I hear, hey, feminist musical, this sounds fun. So moving on to something a little darker, but it's recent and I think a very important film. And that is Jennifer Kent's The Nightingale. So Jennifer Kent previously directed The Babadook, which is a fantastic film about coping with loss. So this is about a young woman. She is, oh, one sec. Sorry about that, lights went out. She's an Irish indentured servant. She serves a commander, a British commander who's currently in Australia. This is during the colonial times, and she is brutalized by him in more ways than one, and eventually suffers an unimaginable loss at his hands. So she wants to get revenge, and she also partners with an Aboriginal man who can track for her. And what this does is it takes the rape revenge horror of like trope that we see in action and horror, and it also turns it into a meditation on the violence of colonialism. And it ties the violence towards this one woman towards the larger violence towards the people who had lived in Australia, the Aboriginal people. Kent herself is Australian, and this was a very important movie for her to make. So as I mentioned earlier about, you know, how certain, you know, countries are always very slow to take on their past. This is, I think, a very good example of talking about the past. And again, some people are like, how is this a political film? I'm like, it's talking about colonialism. How is it not? But I would say absolutely fantastic movie. Not for the faint of heart. I would say obviously content warning. You might want to fast forward or have a couple of cat videos on hand, but still, we're starting to see some films take on colonialism, and this is a great entry into that. And Our final film of the night, our most recent, is Eliza Hittman's Never, Rarely, Sometimes, Always, which was going to have a theatrical release. COVID happened. So this is about a young girl. She's in rural Pennsylvania. She finds that she's pregnant, and she has no local support, so she has to travel to New York. And it is a film that is political by its very nature because of the subject matter that it covers. But Eliza Hittman, rather than going for, let's say, Alexander Payne's, there's a comedy he did called Citizen Ruth, which is a very overt political comedy, lampooning the politics of this debate. Hittman opts for a more humanistic approach where she's like, we're just going to focus on this character and what she's trying to do. And it's also about the relationship that this girl has with her cousin and how scary it can be to be a woman in the world. They're also constantly kind of at risk from other men. The cousin, they both work at a grocery store. The cousin, who is all like 17 years old, has to deal with advances from her older boss. They don't have a place to stay, so they have to kind of spend the night wandering around Port Authority. And it's also hinted that the main character's pregnancy is the product of abuse. And it's, rather than being a screed, Hittman opts to kind of take it on more of just a character's journey. And I mean, I think it's a great film. It's one that I think more people should see, but I think this is an example of how a film can be political without being extremely overt. You know, there's Black Klansman, which is very overt with his politics, and then there's this one, which would kind of, you know, rather you put the politics aside and just watch the film as the story. All right, we're coming to the end. So I do have to talk a little bit about propaganda, because if we're talking about political cinema, we can't not talk about it. And really that is its own, that's its own program in and of itself. So I've mentioned with Black Klansman, there was Birth of a Nation, which I think there's, you know, again, I understand this film's technical achievements and how it influenced later films. Actually, for one of my first film classes, they did show us clips of this movie and they're just like, look, we know it's gonna look bad. But there is no way to not look at this film as propaganda for the Ku Klux Klan. And it actually did help with the second rise in popularity for the Klan in this country. There is also, I would say, probably the most famous example of propaganda, which is Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will, which is a film credited with helping with the rise of Hitler's popularity. Another film is The Founding of a Republic. And actually, I mean, considering Mulan is in the news right now for the Disney film, for not only being fairly nationalist, but also apparently we find out it was filmed in the Zhejiang province where Uyghurs are being kept in concentration camps. There's conversation about, is this just a Disney film, or is this more nationalist propaganda that they made, you know, with the help of China? But China has a history of propaganda, and one that I actually bought in Chinatown because I saw it and I'm like, well, I can't pass this up. It is called The Founding of a Republic, and it is a very sanitized version of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. And what's interesting about this is an all-star cast. Jackie Chan is in it, Zhang Ziyi is in it. It's one where you're like, what are you doing here? But in China, if you would like to keep making movies, sometimes you have to ingratiate yourself to the powers that be. And the final film I'm going to bring up is a US example called Active Valor. So this was a film that came out, I would say, 8 years ago. And it's basically like real Navy SEALs on the job. And there was something that struck me as fairly frightening about that, because the US the US has been involved with Hollywood for a while. I mean, even if it's just you need to use the logos, like Captain Marvel wanted to use logos and plane models, so they had to go through the Air Force, you know, for copyright reasons. But then there's films like The Green Berets, which was made to pretty much make the war in Vietnam look like it was still worth fighting. And There's also Top Gun, which was not really intended to be a military propaganda film, but it led to a high rate of recruitment for the Navy. So the US military has kind of been trying to sort of chase that, finding a picture that can increase recruitment. In Act of Valor, I looked at it and I'm just like, this seems odd that we're doing a feature film where it's just about real Navy SEALs going on a mission. And the thing that I asked myself, I'm like, well, if a country like China did this, would I be calling it propaganda? And I would say, you know, absolutely yes. We're not the same as China, obviously, but there is something about that where I'm just like, is this really a feature film, or is it a showcase of US military power? But that is sometimes, I think sometimes the most, the scariest thing about propaganda is you don't quite see it right away. And, you know, I think even Western democracies can fall victim to this. And so I can't say I'd highly recommend any of these movies. However, if you can ever get your hands on the founding of an empire and you want to see a movie that just completely whitewashes stuff like The Great Leap Forward, it's kind of worth it for a morbid laugh. All right, so thank you for coming. And I'm going to stop the share now. I'm also just wanted to say, show The Confession, Robert Redford's The Candidate, and Warren Beatty's Reds is a few other examples of political films that you can watch. And thank you for listening to me drone on for about an hour. Does anyone have any questions or would like recommendations that they didn't see here? Or does anyone have any recommendations that they would like to give a shout out to, but that they did not see here?
Well, since you brought up the Britain's propensity for class-based comedy, I kind of have to give a shout out to Peter Medock's incredibly dark comedy, The Ruling Class.
The Ruling Class is an amazing film. And that was one of my, it had to go on the chopping block for time, but I would highly recommend The Ruling Class. That is a film with Peter O'Toole, correct?
Yeah.
Peter O'Toole is a man from a wealthy, high-class family who thinks he's the Messiah, and his family is horrified because he's also talking about like, we should really redistribute wealth and help poor people. And then the second half of that film, he thinks he's the reincarnation of another famous person, but I will not say whom because that is it's a reveal. I'll say that. Does anyone have another recommendation or question? Or questions, queries, comments? All right, well, thank you for tuning in. Hopefully you've gotten something out of this. And if you're interested, next month is going to be horror films or horror genres specifically. So anything from zombies to vampires to body horror, you will find it here. Or if that is not your thing, also keep in mind, I do have some upcoming topics. So November, I'm going to be talking about censorship in film. And in December, we are going to be talking about a very fun seasonal topic, what makes a Christmas movie a Christmas movie? Or the subtitle could be, how did Die Hard become a Christmas film? So thank you for coming tonight, and hopefully I will see you next month, and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.